It's not, as in the introduction, this is a bit about, or made primarily about reception. For me, reception is both new and old material. I have sort of a hate-love relationship with it. And I think that image of the vomiting Homer and our question about what does it mean for the material to be recycled could be taken in multiple bodily fluid directions when it comes to how Homer has continued to fertilize and inspire the world that's come. And so, part of what I want to do today is to just give a preview of some other work I'm doing, but also start a conversation about the different levels of reception of Homeric materials. One being sort of an imminent notion of of Homer just being there, Odyssey especially. The other being more direct and intentional, and how these different layers, respond to audience need, but also how it shapes our conversation about the enduring impact of the Homeric epics and the idea of Homer on the world around us. So with that, I'll get going on my prepared comments and try to stick to the time limit. All right. So recently, my family was listening to music as we traveled between Boston and New York, which we've been doing a lot recently since I moved jobs. And the Weeknd's 2024 song Dancing in the Flames started playing. My wife sang along and asked the kids to join her, quoting The Weeknd, on another Odyssey. My oldest child, Alia, who spent way too much time listening to me, immediately said, "No, Mom, everyone dies. It's not a fun story. I'm not going." Uh, my wife shrugged, long accustomed to my pedantry, and continued singing. One way to see this exchange is as the activation of different possible meanings for an or the Odyssey in English. When my wife listens to the song, she hears The Weeknd using a word that simply means journey. And my daughter, who first read Gareth Hines' wonderful graphic novel from 2010, based on the epic when she was 9, has a somewhat narrower view. For her, it's the story of a journey where very bad things happen, and only the old dude, in her words, survives. My casual listening favored my wife's interpretation, but I think there may be more going on here with the song. So, for those of you who don't know The Weeknd and his larger body of work, this falls into The Weeknd sort of like overlapping of driving fast in cars, having orgasms, and dying theme in his work. The song takes place from a moving car, which is a common motif. The lyrics flirt with the idea of an accident, perhaps exulting in the near erotic thought of the sudden explosive end. And the Odyssey in question, then, is in doubt from the beginning. The first verse is about the urgency of the journey. He says, "Traffic dies when we are racing home." And then the second verse brings greater peril, but the singer is responsible for it as he sings, "If I miss the break, we're dancing in the flames." Ultimately, the bridge announces, "Everything is faded. We barely made it. The fire's raging, but you're still beautiful. It's amazing because I can taste it. Our final Odyssey. Oh." Now, this version of Odysseus and the Odyssey, which I actually don't think is too far off from some of the core themes of the epic, contrasts with the more chaste engagement of Odysseus, or with Odysseus, that we could pick out at random from pop music. Christianity and the Greco-Roman classics have existed for about as long, for so long that they produce interwoven images without clear origins. I recently did a study of the appearance of Odysseus in evangelical sermons in the United States, and the way that he gets, let's say, turned around to mean different things there can be a bit bewildering. So one song to consider, and I didn't put the lyrics here, is "The Cave" from 2010 by Mumford and Sons. Marcus Mumford, as many people don't know, the lead singer, grew up in the UK, the child of leaders of the Evangelical Christian Church, the Association of Vineyard Churches. Mumford's song "The Cave" braids together Platonic, Homeric, and Christian imagery. The first line, "It's empty in the valley of your heart, the sun it rises slowly as you walk," recalls in content and rhythm the King James translation of Psalm 23:4, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." The title of the song, though, is based on the second verse where Mumford sings, "So come out of your cave, walking on your hands, and see the world hanging upside down," before he challenges his addressee, "So make your sirens call and sing all you want. I will not hear what you have to say." Now, this use of the Odyssey and the term the siren's call goes deep back into not just Christian, but Neoplatonic ideas, even Stoic ideas about Odysseus as a resilient, resistant character. But Odysseus, let's say the serial adulterer and the murderer of his own men, doesn't quite seem fit for, let's say, Christian theology. And so one of my questions that I was asked to start answering last year that I don't think I fully answered is, how do we start to approach the narrative versatility of a character like Odysseus? Why does he continue to appeal? Why, if anything, is the Odyssey eclipsing the Iliad in its popularity? And at the end, is it just that he's something of an empty signifier who can be adapted to different contexts? I'm not going to claim I can or will answer all these things today, but what I want to do is to give you a preview of some of the questions I wrangle with a book that's coming out in June or July in time for the Odysseus Industrial Complex of 2026. And so I promised in the original take that I'd talk a little bit about Odysseus as an antihero. I'm not going to do this because that one is a bit more complex. And when I sat down and started to figure out the paper, it ran to about 45 minutes to an hour rather than 25. So I will disappoint you. And the three things I'll try to talk about today is sort of our different approach to Odysseus because of our recognition of him as a traumatized veteran. Thinking about Odysseus in retellings in particular and what's going on there. I'm going to suggest some sort of continuity with antiquity. And then Odysseus tomorrow, where I'm going to ask the question of whether Odysseus is a fascist or an anti-fascist and let you answer it yourself. All right, are you ready? Now, I chose these themes in part because the talks before I came today really sort of scooped me on some of the other things I talk about in the book. So just give you a structure of where I start, of where I go in the larger argument. As I start talking about, as Carol did, earlier, that distinction between Odysseus as a traditional figure and Odysseus in the Odyssey. And then following some older approaches, I talk about Odysseus in antiquity. I jump ahead through Renaissance and really dive into translations and how translating the Odyssey is a watershed moment in many literary cultures. But what I'm really giving you here today are sort of samples from chapters 5 and 6. I wasn't sure you wanted to hear about Tennyson and Katsunaxis and others. So I'm going to stick to some really recent stuff here because not many people have written about that so far. All right. So one of the most significant things I think that we can look at to understand the change in Odysseus's popularity in our lifetimes, I think, is the way we treat warriors differently, or our understanding of traumatized veterans in general. I think from the somewhat less serious but still magisterial "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" to the gruesome murders at the end of Pasolini's The Return, the relationship between the lost hero and his loyal bride has become expected by modern audiences. Its dominance, I think, has some ready explanations. You know, we have a cultural consciousness of nostalgia and trauma that's altered the way we've talked about soldiers' experiences in war. So basically, as a general rule, we have sent more better educated soldiery out abroad to fight and die in wars over the past century, and psychological science and psychiatry has increased, and it's increased our awareness of how this shapes people once they return home. And so you can definitely see in the stories we tell about the Odyssey a shifting in the way we think about warriors. So, you know, the Odyssey has, without even the words to in ancient Greek to talk about it, long been a narrative obsessed with nostalgia and trauma. Right? Nostalgia is often the rupture that emerges from trauma. And our cultural understanding of the cost of being a soldier has shifted. I think that Jonathan Shea made Odysseus a bit of a victim of trauma in Odysseus in America. But generally, we have audiences who are receptive to the notion of someone who has been harmed by the harm they have done to others, right? Which I think is an inset theme of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it's not something that is really part of the discourse prior to the 20th century. Now, my lasting image of Ray Fiennes' Odysseus and Pasolini's film is of a gruff, hard man intent on exacting revenge from the suitors. His reunion with Penelope certainly doesn't align with any modern notions of romance, even if the audience's acceptance of marital intimacy as a motivation for the hero's return is crucial to the reception to the story. Now, while Pasolini's plot may echo Odysseus's prayer for Nausicaa's future happiness, namely that a husband and wife, should enjoy homophosune, Fiennes' violence and unrelenting focus reminds me less of matrimonial ideals and more of the traumatized warrior returning home. To put it simply, Fiennes' Odysseus has far more to do with Rambo than with the Ulysses of O Brother, Where Art Thou? And yes, in the book, I do have a large section on Rambo First Blood, which I think has been wildly underestimated as an important intertext. Now, reading Odysseus himself as a subject desiring to find his missing wife can be a little harder if we maintain modern gendered ideas. But the Odyssey itself is amenable to readings that center Penelope as a representation of Odysseus's homecoming and lost identity as a kind of romantic longing. Now, among the modern receptions of Odysseus that lean into this and his status as a returning warrior is the social media phenomenon Epic the Musical. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Epic the Musical. I rejected getting to know it for a while until, again, my daughter said, you need to listen to this. And it turns out that we may not be done with movies about Odysseus as of this summer. There's chatter that Jerry Bruckheimer is going to produce a cartoon version of the full musical of Epic the Musical. I don't know what to make of that. That string of words seems like it might be, ChatGPT created, but let's see what happens. So to fully understand Epic the Musical, I think first we need to think a little bit about fan fiction. And this theme of fan fiction is going to be important as we think again about retellings. So fan fiction is a way for audiences to rewire stories, to create places in them that reflect their own experiences, identities, and interests, or to challenge authoritative structures and assumptions presented by the source traditions. Such participatory culture creates a sense of community within larger groups, even as the rewriting itself can be transgressive and upending the structural and semantic status quo. When I read about fan fiction as a scholar of myth, and there is an entire body of scholarship about fan fiction, it's hard for me to not see it as a natural extension of human storytelling activities. Such an equivalency might be too simplistic, of course, but just open up Pausanias and read some of the wild myths or variants that you get in local places in ancient Greece. And you can start to not only just see ancient living myth differently, but living fan fiction differently as well. Now, Epic the Musical, as it exists currently, is a series of short albums or sagas that are based on the Odyssey and started in 2019 by Jorge Rivera Herranz. What makes it difficult to divine generically is its status as a social media performance piece. Not only were the songs released over time in streaming platforms, but videos of the performers appeared on TikTok with commentary from Rivera Herranz. There's a wiki that includes information about the music, the performers, the lyrics, and the official fan website emphasizes that it's a community place where an entire iconography of cartoons and figures about the characters developed almost independently on their own. So the responsiveness of the work itself to the community is part of what interests this to me as an analogy for ancient narrative production. Now, like many engagements with the Odyssey, Epic the Musical spends most time on Odysseus's own version of his story, followed by the vengeance and reunion. Like the Returns Odysseus, it doesn't touch anything going on in book 24, which I think is an interesting omission that echoes some maybe themes in the text, but also some of our own reluctance to look at the political content of war and a returning veteran. The primary difference with epic's Odysseus. And sorry if you can hear the sirens outside. My office is across from the Empire State Building, so it's a high activity area. So the primary difference with the epic's Odysseus from everybody else you encounter is that somehow he turns out to be a moral character. Early on in the sagas, he wrestles with canonical traditions from the Trojan War, such as killing Astyanax in the Troy saga. He's also responsible for his prolonged absence in the musical as well. The cause of his suffering, according to one of the songs, is that he opposed Athena in the blinding of Polyphemus. The Athena in this story wanted more murder. She wanted more death. And Odysseus says, nope, killing Polyphemus is one step too far for me. Now, a chief example that I think illustrates both the connection between modern understandings of trauma and a cultural rereading of the figure comes in the song Love in Paradise from the Wisdom Saga. Now, the song unfolds almost primarily as a conversation between Odysseus and Calypso. It begins with a montage of previous songs from his travails, and then transitions to a lighter musical number roughly based on Book 5 of the Homeric Odyssey. That based on Book 5 of the Odyssey is my contention. I'm not quite sure if it's the truth, but I'm going to stick with it. The conceit seems to be that Odysseus is at this moment of the song trying to understand how he has been there 7 years. He sifts through his memories, confused, haunted. Our hero ends up physically on a ledge, ruminating over his mistakes and experiences. The production integrates fragments from other songs and provides the spirit, if not the content, of Odysseus's final conversations with Calypso. But the overall emphasis is on a kind of psychic fragmentation. And Calypso's attempt to keep him present in the moment with her instead of drifting back to his past or looking outward to the future. Now, the exchange they have here in the slide is sort of a hinge moment. What I really appreciate from it, and I think what extends to the whole musical as an intervention in the Odyssey tradition, is the way Rivera-Harans teases at the seams of epic and finds spaces between the lines to detect inner workings of the characters. By my interpretation, this entire song, where Odysseus is really upset thinking about his past, reads into a famously opaque sense of a set of lines when we first find Odysseus in the Odyssey, where he's clearly not heroic by any means, because we find him spending every day crying on the shore and then every night sleeping with Calypso, even though she's no longer pleasing to him. Now, there are different interpretations of this. He's longing for his Nostos. He may miss his wife. His sweet life is draining away. But my proposal here is that Rivera-Harans instead is saying he spent the last 7 years thinking about what he did. He's thinking about his losses. He's thinking about his own trauma. This is a rather modern reading that's not necessarily at home with the Odyssey, but I think it is an interesting intervention. There's no indication in epic about the source of Odysseus's sorrow here. He could just be upset about never going home, but the strange disjunction between his behavior and these experiences are what some might call anhedonia. In his Odysseus in America, Jonathan Shea emphasizes off-task coping, rumination, and anhedonia as responses among traumatized veterans. Consider the popularity of violent memories and emotionally paralytic behaviors in veterans on film and television. Neither composer nor audience of Epic the Musical would need to have read Shea's work to imagine a reason for why Odysseus weeps all day and has trouble surrendering to pleasure at night. Such details are available in the story itself. This is a man of much suffering who at this point in the journey has lost all his companions and may never see his wife again. To make things worse, he may be responsible for the death of his friends. And we can edit that. He is responsible for the death of his friends. So Epic the Musical provides its Odysseus with a kind of reflective remorse that we expect from survivors of war and trauma. It dramatizes his experience of it and how he transcends it through focusing on his homecoming and the reintegration of his self. Now, the parts of the musical that give me pause, such as the absence of any of the events and Odyssey 24 or Penelope really having any real character or agency. That aside, the depth of the musical's engagement with epic themes and the duration of fan engagement speaks to a dynamic not dissimilar to receptions of Odysseus in antiquity, where local audiences could craft and explore their own personal Odysseus. Now, beyond translation, beyond adaptation of forms that we've seen here, there's a practice of retelling that has granted the Homeric epics some special notice in the past few decades. We are living in sort of an age of Odysseus. Personally, I would trace some of it back to that movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? I think Emily Wilson's translation was like a neutron bomb on the whole thing. But really, what I think a real watershed moment was in the past 25 years is a publication of Atwood's Penelopiad, followed up not a decade later, a little more than a decade later, by Miller's Circe. Now, works like this are too often dismissed as being anachronistic or faddish in response to canonized literature, but I would rather view them as part of a practice of reception and engagement rooted to and at home in the Homeric tradition itself. And antiquity, as you know, was awash in retellings. Do we see Euripides as Cyclops as something essentially different from what's going on in these works because it's comic? In Euripides and Sophocles, Odysseus shows up as a more calculating, somewhat more evil character, perhaps resonating with audience suspicion of the realpolitik of the Athenian state. So the kind of narrative that acts in part as a corrective interrogation or sort of investigating where marginalized or minoritized groups are represented can cause some lingering discomfort for the canon. But it's also, I think, a time-tested way of engaging with it. And it's in this realm that we find Atwood's Penelopiad. Now, Atwood is fairly interesting in providing a backstory that's fairly well assembled from myth. If you know it well, you could probably trace many of the decisions she makes back to Timothy Gantz's Greek myth book, or to Apollodorus. But she's adapting as much as she retells. She makes Penelope ends up having elevated status through genealogy. Her mother's a naiad. But one of the real things that she does is she focuses on the women in the text in a way that few had before. So the enslaved women become a chorus of accusers during the unfolding of the tale. Penelope tells the story from her own perspective. Now, the Penelopiad can be seen as much as a contestation of a patriarchal Western tradition as a retelling of the story. And in this, I actually think that Atwood's work transcends a lot of scholarship. There's not much academic work on Homer that so thoroughly centers the suffering meted out by authority, implicit to Odysseus's gender and class. And I think you could read her productively alongside, let's say, Theodore Adorno, Max Horkheimer's critique, or Frantz Fanon. Atwood, of course, is transparent about her concerns from the beginning. The enslaved women repeatedly mourned, "We had no voice, we had no name, we had no choice, we had one face, and we face the same." Now, Atwood's revision holds a mirror to the power structures in the Odyssey as a metaphor for those structures that persist in our world, right? It's less about the Odyssey ultimately than it is about the lives of the audiences. Now, despite the outer insistence that she's giving the story to the women in the Odyssey, Atwood's speakers channel an essentially Odyssean uncertainty about any given narrative. Right. So at the same time that she's unsettling some of the power structures, this is a far more literary engagement than some receptions might be. But again, to draw the connection back to, and I missed some slides here, back to what's happening in fan fiction and in Epic the Musical, just because it is a non-traditional scholarly intervention doesn't mean it is not incredibly insightful in doing some of that same work, and that would have been useful there. Now, we all know we're going to get a lot more Odyssey this summer. And one of the things that I've been considering, all along is what is it about that raises up the interest of Odysseus and who is Odysseus? In considering Odysseus's cultural position, Pierre Boitani notes that Ulysses travels so well through time because he starts out as a sign in cultural terms, the sign of an entire episteme. Every culture is free to interpret him, he continues, as such within its own sign system, according him values rooted on the one hand in the mythical features of Odysseus as a character, and on the other in the ideals, problems, and philosophical, ethical, and political horizons of the individual civilization. I find the articulation compelling, but at the same time, it seems to erase any core meaning. If we go back to the three talks earlier today, I mean, how can you talk about Odysseus without talking about him being a trickster and a wanderer? If you just make him an empty sign reflecting our concept of authority and humanity, where do we end up? Now, given Odysseus's tendency towards autocracy in the Odyssey, along with his general function in other myths as a subordinate leader who does whatever's necessary for the completion of the mission, I've often wondered why Odysseus doesn't feature more prominently in fascist and authoritarian literature. For those of you who spend too much time online or have the misfortune of seeing tweets by Jeremy Wayne Tate, you know that Odysseus in the Odyssey has become sort of a cause célèbre of the right wing in the United States, where they will post things online such as, we need people to read the Odyssey so they act more like Odysseus. Things don't get much more sophisticated than that. I mean, if my 15-year-old daughter can undermine that argument, I don't think we're going to go too far there. And I think there's a reason we don't go farther with Odysseus, right? I think there's a good reason he's unaccommodating for authoritarian ideas. Now, in an interview about his life's work, Robert Griffin, an expert on fascism, explains how the conditions of modernity at the intersection of politics, economics, and the information age, and the specter of global environment collapse, seed the ground for fanaticism. He writes, in these moments of profound disorientation, people can latch on to simplistic, paranoid worldview like a drowning person grabbing onto a plank of wood. I couldn't avoid that one. This revelatory, deeply mythic worldview diagnoses the root causes of chaos and misery while creating a starkly dualistic Manichaean division of good and evil. One might think that the complicated man might be the precise example needed for those overwhelmed by our time. But again and again, Robert Griffin continues, for those ill-equipped to cope with the sheer complexity of the modern world, the explosion of cultural mixing and diverse realities brought by modernity can create a tremendous sense of decadence experienced as evil, as if the world is falling apart. Yet, when we look at the last great paroxysm of fascism, what we find are characters really going away from Odysseus, with the exception perhaps of the figure of Ulysses who shows up in Ezra Pound's Cantos. Odysseus ends up in a slightly different territory. In Primo Levi's work about the Holocaust, he shows up on multiple occasions as someone who represents everyman and humanity. And there's just one last anecdote I want to leave you with for the possibility of what Odysseus can do for us in dynamic storytelling situations. So there's a story told about the German occupation of Poland when the Germans were about to retreat in World War II. According to oral and written histories, the director Tadeusz Kantor was planning to stage a performance of a drama entitled "The Return of Odysseus" by Stanislaw Wyspiański in the train station as the Germans left. Right. The version of the play follows a similar plot to Pasolini's The Return. It focuses on Odysseus' arrival in Ithaca and his plan for vengeance. And in this story, Odysseus has transgressed against his father and can't reconcile with him. Instead, he tries to flee to an imaginary version of Ithaca, one that reminds him of his youth. He ends up turning back to his island, cursed by the voices of Odysseus' dead. And in part, Odysseus becomes a figure who represents both the desire to return to a past that never existed and the impossibility of escaping the past that was real and continues to press upon us. Cantor planned to stage this production at the Krakow train station while the Nazis were retreating from the Russian front lines. In one interpretation, he imagined Odysseus as the returning soldiers, men who had committed horrible acts of violence, desperate to be rescued by a home that no longer existed. Cantor never staged this performance in full, but he did in this reconstruction offer parts of it in his own apartment while the city was liberated. Right. So the smaller performance unfolded in rooms ravaged by war, suffused by the real impact of the experience of violence and scarcity. And in this setting, Odysseus is a fascist defeated, a figure who went to war for lost cause. This version of the story, threadbare and depressing, was also likely challenging Odysseus as a figure of disenchantment. We become Odysseus by gazing with him. We look out into the world we've experienced and desperately try to flee to a world that the audience knows isn't there. So, it's not uplifting, I know, to end at the Holocaust when our last talk began with Homer puking into the mouths of the successors. But in truth, it's not the end, but a transition from one era to another through the experience of unspeakable evil. The mechanized horrors of the world wars and the industrial and then informatic alienation of the next generations have set us all adrift in one way or another. In her essay, We Refugees, Hannah Arendt compares the Jewish diaspora to Odysseus, writing, quote, the desperate confusion of these Ulysses wanderers who, unlike their great prototype, don't know who they are, is easily explained by the perfect mania for refusing to keep their identity. In this, Odysseus becomes someone who becomes a focal point for us to think about how it is we know who we are and sustain that identity, which is, of course, a essential question of the Odyssey, which starts out by the confirmation that Odysseus can't return home until other people confirm his identity, and then ends the poem with the promise that we can have wealth and peace together if we're willing to give up our memories of the harms we have done to each other. So in this, I think Arendt asks us to contemplate the impossibility of assimilation, the constant threat of violence, the hands of others who will not endure fundamental differences, and the essential multifaceted nature of the human race. So Odysseus appeals to us all for reasons I think I've mentioned, but his malleability allows him to transform the heroic into a wit, to endure as a survivor, to return as a father and king, to be a vehicle for the voyage into the unknown. He can and does represent the very power structures and extreme violence that have been essential to the Western tradition, but he also in that represents the dream of agency and self-determination, right? Odysseus is nobody in order to become himself again, and by doing so, he lives to become another tale and allow us to reconceive the world around us through him. Thank you. I'll stop the share.
Many thanks, Joel. In Homeric fashion, you've woven together a number of really diverse instances of reception. My own kids will be pleased to hear that you've argued that Epic the musical should be taken seriously. So I'll start listening differently now when it's put on. So I'll open up the questions to the floor. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So I just want to, probably I'm the only person in the room who actually listened to Epic the Musical before. But I found it very interesting that in your presentation, you mentioned that there's kind of a return veterinarian kind of this kind of trope surrounding this retelling of the Odyssey. What I found that's like really interesting is that right at the beginning of the play, in the musical, he deliberately kind of pulled this this event for Odysseus killing the son of Hector, right? This is not originally from Homer, but from this really like the Iliad. So do you feel that there's like a certain kind of force that he's forcing this part to kind of like he pulled that into his story in order to kind of to make it fit more into this kind of veterinarian returning kind of?
I mean, I think that's a really insightful question, and to me, it speaks at first to differences in experiences of the narrative for ancient and modern audiences. And so I'll give you like two answers. Like one answer is yes, I think he brought that intentionally in order to give modern audiences an idea of the depth of savagery that we're talking about, because this is not a detail people would know well. But on the other hand, I think he is doing that, and I don't know if the director, if Rivera Herons knew this, but I think he's replicating or creating the knowledge that ancient audiences had. And for me, this is confirmed by the structure of book 6 of the Iliad, which starts out at the beginning with Agamemnon telling his brother that you have to kill all the men of Troy, even the babies in their mother's wombs. And then at the end of the book, the one baby we get to see is Astyanax. So for me, Astyanax is a metonym for all of the children who die in the Trojan War. And that he was such a, the motif, the iconography of him being killed in different ways, either being used to bludgeon Priam or thrown from the walls. It was so prominent that I think most ancient audiences would have known that. So I think it's a good observation of the challenges that modern receptions have to providing more context for the story. But I don't know if I would call it forced. I would just call it, let's say, strategic.
Okay, thank you so much. I have one more question, if possible.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's more of a pop culture one, because when I look at the modern readaptation on the Odyssey, it's very interesting that most of the storytelling are in like a linear way, rather than like adapting from like in the Odyssey kind of way, like starting from like. And also, we also kind of neglecting the Phoenicians, which is also very interesting. So, is there like a reason why they all the time?
I don't know that I can give one reason. I just think there's a tradition of flattening the Odyssey out to the Apologos. I think the best 22-minute version of this is an episode from the show DuckTales called Homer Sweet Home, or Homer Sweet Homer, right? Where they basically just like they tell the entire story of his journey, but of course it's DuckTales characters. There's just this cultural mass of knowledge, of familiarity with those stories. And I'm sorry I missed Carol's presentation, but my general sense is that even in antiquity, the Homeric Odyssey as we had it would have been really weird. If you just think about it, I mean, who wants to spend that much time with Telemachus? Right? I mean, nobody does. And then, the way that we expand books 13 through 24, a priori, there's no reason for it to take that long, right? It's an incredibly complex narrative that's subtle and nuanced. And I think the linearity of the narrative of the Odyssey lulls people into submission. And they think they understand it when they don't. I'm not going to get all allegorical on you and say it's really about metempsychosis, like the Neoplatonists did. But there's a lot more going on. And I think that we've just been very selective in popular conscious with the legendary parts of it.
Thank you so much.
I think we have time for one more question. Ivana, you had
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk. I'm a huge fan of the Penelopiad. And, it's one of those books when I remember where I was when I was reading it. So I really liked your take on this type of work being also scholarship, not like just creative engagements. And to this, I just wanted to tell you that because I also admire Madeline Miller, we invited Madeline Miller to give a talk about her process at UVA. And the way that she talked about her process was like, I imagine a Hellenistic poet and their process. She was telling us about all the different versions of the story of Circe that she's read and how she was picking parts that made sense to her and then rejecting stories that did not make sense for her and her vision of Circe as a character. She revealed so much learning and such an intimate familiarity with all kinds of versions that frankly we were floored. And I think Atwood also is a very careful reader of the Odyssey, who I think what Emily Wilson claims she did with her translation, basically Atwood did with her retelling.
I couldn't agree with you more. Right. I just think that there's a tradition of literary retellings. And I think if we frame Atwood's work with like Grendel or Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, we get a real sense of how you can read in and out of traditions and adapt them. And I firmly think that it's similar to the way that the stories were adapted to the needs of ancient audiences, even on the tragic stage. In the English-speaking world, there's a great example that I talk more about in the book, which is Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, which actually ends up being the first time that Odysseus is in the story in that Western tradition. In the earlier source texts from Boccaccio and others, Odysseus doesn't show up, but suddenly Thersites and Odysseus are there on the stage with Shakespeare, coincidentally, and I'm saying coincidentally because I don't think it's a coincidence, within a decade of the publication of the translation of books 1 and 2s by Chapman. And so there's something going on there with sort of our literary engagements. We now think Shakespeare is just literature on its own. But at the same time, right, that Troilus and Cressida was a retelling of a legendary tradition that was very popular in European romance that has now been recanonized. And so I think that really sophisticated, engaged works like the Penelopiad and Miller's Circe will in the future be seen as part of a larger literary reconsideration of the past.
Thank you.